Today's session consisted primarily of me reading my work aloud. That was basically the whole thing. I would sit at the computer, I would read my story, and honestly, just went through and read it several times through and just started making corrections as I went. The art of reading aloud is super, 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 super important, guys. I think I've talked about this before, but basically, if you are your own editor, which all of us are, every writer is their own editor, right? Even if you have an editor that you send stuff to, you're still your own editor for the first, dozen drafts at least, or however many times you go through it. And so, since you are your own editor, the biggest tool you have is the ability to read out loud. Because when you read out loud, you remove the stuff that you overlook. When you mentally read things, your brain tends to skip over certain words, certain phrases that are awkward, certain certain articles that maybe shouldn't be in there, or maybe adds articles that don't exist. And when you have to read work aloud, especially if it's in maybe a weird font that you're not used to reading from, maybe something you have to maybe squint a little bit to read, there are certain ways to play around with it. But when you read your work aloud, it's as close to you being a stranger as possible, which is what you want, right? A stranger is your best editor because there's no bias there, right? There's no brain filling in the gaps. And so when you are forced to read aloud, you pick up on a lot of things that you're missing. And you also start to pick up on the idea of readability. You'll notice that as you read, and especially me today, you'll add certain words in to make sentences sound better, or you'll take certain words out to make it sound better when you read it aloud. And it's an awesome tool for you to add or cut certain things. Today I actually added in quite a few words to this story just because it sounded better when I read it aloud. It sounded much more conversational, much more of a storyteller's type of voice when I read it. And excuse me. But for me, that was the biggest benefit of doing that, and it's so needed. It's quite alarming and quite shocking to actually look at your work before you read aloud, like when you edit it all the way, edit it several times. And then when you start reading it aloud, you can pick up on tons of mistakes, and it's so alarming because you would never think of it. If you never read aloud, you would never realize it. You would never, this stuff would never even occur to you. And so what I would suggest is that you start reading your work aloud. Start going through it several times, reading it aloud. And you'll find that as time goes on, you'll improve. Your work will get much better. It's a nice small trick, but it is so necessary. So give it a try. Do that. Even better is to print it off and actually make little handwritten notes in the margins of your paper rather than just reading off a screen. If you're like me and you don't have a printer or you can't afford to start spending money on printing all your work off every single time, computers can be fine, but something actually having in hand is super awesome. Back when I was going for my MFA, a lot of professors, they would do readings nightly, and they would often make notes in the margins. They would actually have the sheet of paper, have their pen, and as they were reading, they would start to make little notes in the margins, like, oh, got to add this, I got to rework this sentence here, whatever, and they would just make notes as they went along, even pausing at certain points. Super important. So that's a tip for everyone today. Read your work aloud and just see how well your story looks in comparison afterwards.